We're very excited to be talking about this brand new framework, which was only released publicly last week. You may have already seen the pieces and a short animation about it, which were published last Wednesday on Zilliant. If not, please do take a look. So the Resilience Dividend Valuation Model has been developed in the past year or so through a partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation and the RAND Corporation. And its underlying aim is to help you make the case for investments that boost resilience. To do that, it provides a toolkit for putting a value on the resilience dividend, which is essentially the sum of benefits from a project investment based on resilience principles compared to one that isn't. And to explain the rationale behind the model, how it was developed and how it can be applied, we have a panel of experts today who are going to talk through those different aspects. So we have with us Sundaa Bridgett-Jones, who is Senior Associate Director at the Rockefeller Foundation. She specialises in international development and resilience work. We have Craig Bond, who is co-author of the report on the model and a Senior Economist at the RAND Corporation. We also have Mike Young, who's Research Chair in Water and Environmental Policy at the University of Adelaide and a Research Fellow with Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. Mike worked actually on one of the case studies in the report. There are 6 of them. And the one he worked on looks at future management of water resources in Diamond Valley in Nevada. And after that, we're also going to speak with Evan Greenfield, who's an advisor on integrating environment, social and governance concerns into financial investments, about how this model might be used by investors. In the final half an hour or so of the webinar, we're going to open it up to your comments and questions, and you'll actually have the opportunity this time to speak via the audio function, and we'll give you details on how to do that a little bit later. And so before we start, I'd just like to flag up a couple of things. First, if you hear people talking about the RDVM, that's the acronym for the Resilience Dividend Valuation Model. And if you're tweeting about the webinar today, please do try to use the hashtag Resilience Dividend. So without further ado, let's turn the conversation over to Sundaa Bridgett-Jones from the Rockefeller Foundation, who's going to tell us about why the foundation got behind this project and what it's hoping might come of it. Thanks, Sundaa.
Thanks so much, Megan, and good morning or good evening to everyone who's joining us today. I'm really pleased that we have this webinar to be able to share some of the lessons from our journey over the past year on the Resilience Dividend Valuation Model. I just want to first thank our panelists for participating today, Craig, Mike, and Evan. Very much appreciate your efforts over the past year and for insights that you'll share today. And certainly want to thank all of our listeners. This has been a terrific journey. I think all of you know that the Rockefeller Foundation has been at the forefront of really trying to grow the discourse around resilience over the past decade. We've had $500 million of investments in resilience building, mainly in the urban space, but in other spaces as well, with great initiatives like the 100 Resilient Cities, the Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, Rebuild by Design, and many others. And throughout all of that, I think if you recall, there was a lot of discourse, and perhaps I'm hoping that that has died down around what is resilience. And I think we've gotten past that conversation about what is resilience. We're starting so now that we have a better understanding of what it is, how do we begin to measure it? But even further, how do we begin to value it? So we were asking ourselves maybe 3 questions, all within the frame of trying to come up with a business case for resilience investments. And the first question is, what makes for fundamental differences between resilience investments and business as usual investments? We certainly wanted that to be critical kind of research and analysis, particularly for investors where we saw a lot of interest in resilience and wanted to see a lot of financial resources coming behind it, particularly in urban spaces where we know the demographics are shifting rapidly. I think the second question for us is, so after understanding those differences, and how do we appraise that that additionality, that additional value? And You know, we know that there is cost-benefit analysis, there's net plus, there are a number of other things out there, but nothing seemed to really capture in a more comprehensive way what we might learn about resilience. And I think the third question for us is, how do we actually think about this as a part of a decision-making tool for decision makers as they try to make, you know, try to analyze some particular investments before them? Do I choose project A over project B, and why? And so we really wanted to have a framework that will allow decision makers to be able to make those better decisions. And so in 2014, with Dr. Judith Rodin, former president of the Rockefeller Foundation, came out with her book on the resilience dividend, I think there were a lot of really fascinating, insightful stories about the multiple benefits of investing in resilience. She talked about Katrina, she talked about what happened in Superstorm Sandy in New York, and in other examples. And so that concept of the resilience dividend, the multiple benefits derived from resilience investments, was out there, but we really wanted to have kind of that that grounding from a metrics and economic perspective about what that actually means. And that began the journey for the resilience evaluation work. And we were really fantastically excited to have the RAND Corporation partner with us, their team of economists and social scientists who really helped to look at this question very systematically. We also had the Global Infrastructure Basel Foundation working along with us, focusing on the application of their Smart Scan tool, particularly to infrastructure projects. And we, together, those two teams, we wanted to try to test various tools in different settings around different archetypes, cases, et cetera, about how this might work out. We had an advisory group of 4 different experts also joining us as well, and to give feedback, it was a very iterative process. We learned together, and we learned a lot about the difference between what it means to do monitoring and evaluation of projects, focusing on resilience, and what it means to do kind of an economic valuation around projects. And so Craig will certainly share with you more about how this tool combines various elements of those 2 areas, project evaluation and economic valuation. And he will also share, among others, how this tool has been used in the cases that we've looked at and what we've learned from it. We've learned a good deal. And I just want to end by saying that I think this is the beginning, for all of us. And having a framework like this and looking at its elements and seeing what might be applicable in different cases, we definitely drove towards applicability in a number of different cases, broad applicability. But I think this is going to be a great opportunity for us hereafter to learn more about how people are using this. So with that, I'd love to turn it over to Craig Bond, who's just been outstanding and terrific and very fun around, introducing us to these various economic concepts. So Craig, over to you.
Thanks, Sunday, and good morning, good evening to everyone that's on the webinar. What I want to do today is just briefly go through sort of what we came up with our partnership with Rockefeller, sort of a relatively high-level sort of introduction to the Resilience Dividend Valuation Model. I've got some slides to help to help lead the discussion, so hopefully this will work. Okay. And so we have our slides here. So one thing I'd like to point out is that we had to, at the beginning of our partnership, we sort of had to normalize some terms and a lot of terminology. Our particular team here at RAND is pretty heavily trained up on the economic side of valuation exercises. And although we have some expertise at RAND on studying resilience in general, the particular team members were a little less familiar with some of the terms. So a lot of our initial effort was in learning and talking about and normalizing language. And so here, I'd like to sort of tee up the definition of the resilience dividend as we're going to use it over the course of the webinar. And here it's simply the resilience dividend is defined as the difference in outcomes from a project that was designed with a resilience lens as compared to a business as usual. And that business as usual project is really specific to the analysis. In some cases, business as usual might be a no project type of scenario. In other cases, for example, if a particular city, for example, was deciding between a green infrastructure versus a gray infrastructure sort of investment project to deal with storm surge, say, or some other sort of environmental risk, the business as usual scenario might be more traditional gray infrastructure, right? So there's a lot of subjectivity here in terms of what the baseline is against we are comparing a resilience project. We'll talk about this a little later, but these net benefits mean that we can have outcomes, we can have benefits that may in fact accrue to stakeholders prior to a shock. We call those co-benefits. And then of course, more in keeping with traditional resilience ideas, we can think about benefits that arise from increases in absorptive capacity, the ability to withstand a shock, or recovery capabilities. It's important to note here that what we're doing is not necessarily measuring the value of increased resilience, although that's a part of the resilience dividend, but the resilience dividend concept is actually a little bit more broad. So keep that in mind as we go through here. So what is the model? Well, the model was derived through conceptualizing how we might actually quantify the resilience dividend over a number of different contexts by using a capital theoretic dynamic sort of modeling structure. Basically, you could think of it as a combination of program evaluation and economic evaluation. And in fact, the subtools that you would use in applying the model basically involve either causal inference methods or simulation modeling. And the difference there comes in whether you're looking backwards in an ex post way at a project that's already been implemented, or looking forward in terms of projects that perhaps a government is deciding between and they'd like to do some modeling on the front end. So we wanted to develop a system that was applicable to both cases and was also applicable across a wide variety of circumstances and systems. So I'll use the term system here to just denote the set of stakeholders and relationships that are being affected by a particular project. That can be as small as an individual or as large as a nation, right? So we needed to be very broad there. I noted that in the capital theoretic, we came at this idea using what's called in environmental economics, the idea of inclusive wealth. And that is that essentially wealth is a forward-looking indicator of welfare in dynamic systems. And here, wealth could include not only the value of man-made stocks, but also social capital and environmental capital, and any number of things. So that's really where we were coming at. You'll see that here in a little bit. We'd like to think that the approach is very flexible, and it helps users think about the system and the potential impacts of a system in a very structured, systems-focused way. We also learned as a result of our work over the last year or so that really the modeling exercise actually helps users, we think, develop data collection plans to think about the elements of the dividend that are most important to them, knowing full well that in an evaluation framework, oftentimes you're faced with scarce resources and you may not be able to do everything you'd like to do. So with that said, I'd also like to mention what the resilience dividend is not, right? It's important to understand that what we've put together is not a black box because we needed the flexibility to be able to apply it to any number of circumstances. I mentioned that, in fact, we are not necessarily interested in valuing the state of system resilience, although we have some ideas about how the model might be used to do so. Rather, we're valuing the resilience dividend. And I'd like to point out that as we go through here and understand a little bit about what the model is, this is not a totally new way of thinking about a particular problem. Rather, we're combining elements of dynamic project evaluation and economic valuation in order to quantify the net benefits associated with the resilience dividend. So how do we sort of think about a system, modeling a system? Well, in the inclusive wealth framework that we base the model on, the idea is that you have any number of capital stocks that are run to a system that are combined in some way to produce flows of goods and services, right? These are the round circles that you see sort of in the middle of the diagram there. So we're really thinking about the system in terms of the production of the goods and services that any stakeholder in the system might care about, right? Those flows are ultimately, through some sort of an intervention, may in fact be interrupted, augmented, or whatnot. And what we want to do is be able to translate the change in those flows to monetary values associated with well-being. So the flow from intervention, either augmenting a capital stock, changing the capital stocks, changing a production technology or whatnot, into the goods and services really has to do with program evaluation. The linkages from the goods and services to well-beings really has to do with economic valuation. What was especially attractive about this particular way of conceptualizing the problem was that we recognize that in a lot of resilience interventions, what we're really trying to do is augment the way that individual agents in the system might behave. So we needed a way to sort of coherently think about how behaviors might be affected by interventions, whether that's augmenting certain stocks of social capital to provide additional substitution possibilities in the face of a shock, or by providing information that allows people to take protective actions in the face of an environmental stressor or whatnot. And so we have what we call the allocation mechanism sort of built into the idea of the model, in that when capital stocks or institutions change, behavior can change as well. In particular, the allocation mechanism allows us to go from an intervention to a change in information, institutions, or constraints, to changes in behavior, and then to the changed flow of goods and services that we sort of see throughout the system. And what we recognized was that within the characteristics of resilient systems that Rockefeller had been working with, namely awareness, diversity, self-regulation, integration, and adaptation, are oftentimes very, very related to the ideas of information and behavior constraints. And so understanding and testing how a particular intervention might change behaviors on the parts of individuals or groups of stakeholders is sort of critically important here. So from there, knowing that we're dealing with dynamic systems, we sort of conceptualize the resilience dividend as the net present value of the difference in the sort of system path in terms of social welfare with a project, and then relative to the business as usual. And you can think about the sort of traditional things that a resilience project might do in the sort of structure of this graph. So for example, in between project and a shock or a portfolio of shocks, if there's a differential between the benefits that exist with the project, the resilience project, and without the resilience project, we're going to call those co-benefits. Then of course, if a shock actually happens, we know that there may be an interruption in the sort of the flow of social welfare, if you will, the flow of well-being. And to the extent that a resilience project can help a system withstand that shock a little bit more, we sort of augmented the absorptive capacity of the system. And then of course, on the back end of that, we can look at a recovery path. And all of those elements are conceptually within the resilience dividend. Now, where are the problems here? The problems come in here either in an ex ante or an ex post case, or especially, excuse me, in an ex post case, is that we only get to see one of these paths, right? If we implement a project, then we only get to see that project. And so the analytical challenge becomes, okay, how do we estimate the business as usual path? And that's where the causal inference sort of econometric tools come into play. On the other hand, if we're looking forward, then we need to have some sort of modeling capability to go forward and project out what each of these paths might be. This is, in fact, we used some work that Mike did in Diamond Valley in order to do this in the Diamond Valley case that we talked about. So basically, data availability and where sort of how we're looking at a particular project or potential projects determines what we can do and what must be estimated, right? Oftentimes, I think that in reality, what you'll end up with is what we might call a partial resilience dividend calculation, wherein we know that certain elements related to social welfare can be estimated, and then others cannot be. And we may have to describe those qualitatively or put certain bounds on those things in order to make better decisions. So the types of interventions that we've typically been thinking about over the course of this work are changes in the provision of public or quasi-public goods, right? Sort of directly. So the idea there would be, okay, if a particular municipality was to change the infrastructure in such a way to protect against storm surge or whatnot, we would consider that sort of a public good type of aspect. We know that interventions may, in fact, directly go in and try to augment or change the quantity or quality of either man-made, natural, or human capital stocks. And then finally, pursuant to what I was talking about the allocation mechanism, there seem to be quite a number of interventions that may change particular incentives that agents face in a system, that change access to capital stocks or goods and services, that change the information structure over which people in the system might behave, changing technology, or alternatively, changing social capital and the relationships, the networked relationships therein. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they sort of provide a guide for thinking about how particular interventions might be modeled within the RDVM. We've tried to put together sort of a notional idea of what might be in resilience dividend, and so we structured this left-hand particular slides are sort of shorter is the here to measure inference, right-hand sort of sector order causal might be more difficult to measure. So, for example, we have well-established methodologies to figure out what the benefits of increasing storm protection from augmented infrastructure might be, or the valuation related to, say, increased forest stocks and the various ecosystem services that might be provided by those stocks. We know that for example, in the Diamond Valley case that we took a look at, we know that there might be decreased income for producers or other sorts of benefits. We know that when we change institutions around, essentially we may relax a constraint, and that may enable additional behaviors such as increased access to financial capital or social programs that allow people to either purchase assets or buy goods and services that they might not otherwise have access to. On the other hand, we've got second and higher order effects that might be more difficult to measure, primarily because of data limitations and the time scale that's needed in order to estimate them. So these would include things like better enabled development opportunities in sort of a larger sort of citywide system, longer term shifts in income generating potentials, a lot of the non-market benefits either related to ecosystem services or some other things where the particular ecosystem relationships are not well understood by the scientific community. And we spent a lot of time thinking about changes in social capital, and although the literature is moving forward on valuing changes to network structures and whatnot, there's still a lot of interesting work to be done In general, the steps in using the model are quite simple conceptually and quite difficult to do in practice, I think. It takes a lot of skills, but the general idea is to understand the intervention and the business as usual case and make sure that they're defined, come up with a conceptualization of the system in terms of the capital stocks and the flows and the measures of well-being that we think are important, defining the shocks and the stressors that the system faces, mapping out the potential changes in the system as a result of the intervention, and then ultimately, once we've done that, we can either simulate or test what the intervention actually did to the project path relative to the business as usual case, and then value it using principles of economic valuation, either market or non-market in nature. And I've mentioned that some of the skills that would actually be needed to use this model well are familiarity with project and program evaluation principles. It's in an ex post sense, methods of causal inference that allow us to state and test hypotheses about intervention A causing effect B. Simulation modeling is often needed in an ex ante case, and it helps to be familiar with benefit cost analysis. I'll wrap up here by saying that we think that the advantages of the RDVM approach are that we have an explicit link to project-related benefits. The model itself and our sort of implementation of the model over the case studies has highlighted the importance of behavioral changes in terms of how it ultimately affects the valuation within the system. We do believe that the mapping structure allows users to sort of think about these causal relationships and ultimately provide guidance about empirically testing hypotheses that exist within the conceptualization of the system. The model is consistent with economic theories of welfare and in general microeconomic welfare analysis. And of course, every arrow that we sort of think about in terms of going from either a relationship between capital stocks to project flows to well-being are in fact empirically testable. The disadvantages here are very related to what the model is not, right? We need to sort of explicitly represent the system in a sort of structured way. We know that the model is data intensive, and in many cases, some data may not be available, which of course would render the model significantly less useful in some cases. We also, as we went through our case studies, realized that just about everything we do in this world is very context specific, right? Systems will be different across different contexts. Interventions will be different. Measures of welfare will be different. And that makes it sort of more difficult to generalize at sort of a level that's easy to sink your teeth into. I'll also point out that we think that that the RDVM is very complementary to other frameworks that are out there. We hope that for those of you that are on this webinar, that you can read the documents, that you find something of use in those documents. And I'm looking forward to taking your questions as we move forward here.
Thanks very much indeed, Craig. I think that will help everybody on the webinar understand a lot more what's behind the model, how to use it, and what it can and can't do. As I mentioned earlier, the reports that you produced also include 6 case studies. I think 4 of them were based in Asia, and 2 of them applied to situations in the United States. And so we're going to bring in Mike Young now, who worked on the case study around water rights and water management in Diamond Valley in Nevada, to tell us a little bit about his experience of using it and what the model could and couldn't quantify in the Diamond Valley case study. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks actually so much, Megan. I'm going to share my screen as well, and hopefully that will, if I do this correctly, will enable us to talk about the Diamond Valley constructively. Where is the Diamond Valley first for those? It's in Nevada, the United States. It's a very small, remote community which specializes in irrigation, largely growing hay that is exported through to other parts of the United States and even overseas. This community relies solely on a groundwater resource, and they have spent the last really 20 or 30 years developing irrigation there, and have suddenly realized over the last 10 years that the groundwater resource is running out, and they've been using it unsustainably. So the big challenge for people in the Nevada's Diamond Valley, close to a town called Eureka, was to work out what to do. And they'd got to the stage that the state engineer responsible for water management in the state had threatened to shut down most of their farms to try and bring it back to sustainability. And the community was very worried about that. And eventually they got together in 2015 and shaped a vision for their community that was about being economically stable and prosperous in the broadest way. And I, as a trained economist specializing in the design of water rights systems, was asked in to try and see if we could find what they said they needed: a united, fair and forward-thinking way about how to use their water, very much within the resilience framework. Out of that emerged an idea that I developed, that they needed a robust water entitlement and allocation system, one that could be expected to work no matter what happened, and through that would build a resilient community. So the robust institutional set of rules would create the resilience. Out of that, we realized we needed a plan that was affordable, practical and applied. And ultimately, we came up with a system which was really developed from Australia's water management frameworks and experience, that they needed an unbundled, as we describe, water entitlement and allocation system. And that would require them to change the water rights that used to be a right to take, or still are at this stage, a right to take a fixed volume of water, into one that said essentially the community needs to find a fair way to share water. The way to do that was to issue shares to give everybody seasonal allocations and approvals and works approvals to use water that included a complete commitment to actually metering all use. At the moment, and still as they transition through, actually all use was unmetered. There was no control. Out of this, they would expect to see two water markets emerge, one for shares and one for the seasonal allocations. And that would enable them to adapt to a process where effectively they had to halve the amount of water that they were taking out of the system. And full implementation now is expected next year. It's taken the community really 3 years from when we started this to talk through the process, agree, put together a plan, and really work through to a solution. The dividend that comes out of this, I think, is really interesting. As an economist, I was involved in helping put together the simple estimates that come from an economist in terms of what it would mean, and we compared various outcomes and concluded that the sharing system was the more sustainable one. But the real thing that came out apart from income was a realization that it would maintain a lot more jobs, keep the community really prosperous. And the thing that I noticed most out of all of this is that the community as a whole suddenly saw itself as a community that had a future. They could see a way to restore agricultural prosperity. They've been watching the value of their farms decline. They suddenly saw there was a new way out. And that was really exciting to see everybody working together, and also seeing the benefits that flow through to the town in Eureka. That town's now looks like it's going to be actually prosperous again. And the transition is really impressive when you sit down and talk. So out of this journey came a recognition that there was a need for a way to talk about resilience and to change what had previously been a standard economic discussion through into one that recognised how important it is for a community to start searching for frameworks that are resilient and enable change and build transitions forward. And I've been really excited to be involved with this township, with the agricultural community, as they have agreed collectively to transition through to something which I think will bring them back into a very, very exciting future. Thanks very much, Megan.
Thanks, Mike. That is fantastic in the sense that you explained how in the process shape the outcome, not just provide us with numbers that economists could crunch. But I think some of the difficulties with the model do lie around putting a value on that sort of community building and additional community trust that comes through the process. And I just want to bring Evan in at this stage and ask Evan, you know, is this something that really matters from a private sector perspective? Do investors really care about this kind of social cohesion, this social capital building which appears to happen with many resilience projects? Evan has actually spent most of his career as a private equity investor, and he was formerly helping to oversee impact investing at Deutsche Bank in the Americas region. And before that, he was a private equity investor in India. So I think he's very qualified to give us that perspective. Do these things really matter to investors nowadays, Evan?
Well, I would say, first off, congratulations to RAND Corporation and Rockefeller Foundation and Thomson Reuters for putting together this innovative model to have an assessment of the societal factors that certainly do, to answer your question, have an impact on the investment community as it portrays to investing in opportunities that could have significant economic return, but also societal benefits. And, you know, I think there's a misnomer that those two elements are in conflict. They're actually work perfectly well together. As Mike pointed out in his case study, the societal benefits will only increase the economic or investment return to investors. So we can think of an example where we can utilize the dividend model to come up with a quantified assessment as to what the societal benefit will be. And that will be allowed to go forth to the community and the underlying constituents where a new project may be put in place. And if it's a positive factor and a positive score that we can quantify and qualify, you would imagine that that project will start getting up and running that much faster from a licensing and a permitting standpoint. And we think any time a project can get up and running that much faster, that's going to allow the investors to start seeing a return. So there's a whole swath of opportunities where having this societal benefit will also allow for greater investment return.
And how do you think this new model might actually help in terms of quantifying that, putting a value on it, and basically getting out and selling this aspect of resilience work even further to investors?
Sure. What would be a net benefit of the model is a situation where we could have an opportunity where we can compare and contrast various opportunities by using the same type of data and model going into it. So we can have a like-for-like comparison. So we can look at project A, look at project B, and the output of the Resilience Dividend Valuation Model, we can then make the assessment what has the better quantified outcome. So I think any times for the investment community where we can quantify qualitative information, and it's not always easy, but have a template for doing that will yield net positive returns for that assessment.
And what do you think is the best way to get this work out there into the investor community, Evan? I mean, so far, a lot of the work has been done by academics in conjunction with the multilateral development banks or development agencies like Oxfam who were involved, or perhaps public authorities. you know, if you were to recommend to Rand and Rockefeller, you know, how to really get this work onto the desks of investors, where does that need to go?
Sure. So a couple of areas to effectuate that in a rapid manner is one, education. Obviously pointing to the case studies that Mike just talked through and having more case studies, having a model that if we can simplify it a bit further than where it is today, and that there's an Excel model with templates, that would be a significant factor such that investment professionals would have the ability to understand how to use it and to use it effectively. But I think a real fundamental aspect to making sure that demand for an opportunity like this is as catalyzed as quickly as possible is to talk to the asset owners. Asset managers, i.e. an infrastructure fund, will be tremendously responsive from the asset owner. So if we can go and talk to pension funds and endowments and foundations that are investing into these underlying investment vehicles and make sure they understand this model and make sure that, more importantly, that they impose upon their underlying general partners they're investing into that they have to utilize this model, take-up will happen very, very quickly. The other aspect I would mention to this equation is we have this really interesting universe of something called green bonds, which has grown quite considerably over the last several years. We're at about $60 billion of assets allocated to green bonds. The challenge with green bonds is there's no real benchmark standardization qualification. If we can utilize this model such that every green bond that's being issued has to report this resilience dividend valuation metric score, that would be quite significant in making sure that the ramp up happens in the very near term.
Okay, thanks, Evan. I think that's really, really helpful in terms of explaining how we're going to get it off the paper, off the screen, and really out there into the wider world. So our audience have been listening intently, I hope. But today, with this Resilient webinar, we're going to try and do something a little bit different, a little bit new to what we've done so far. We'd like to take some direct questions from the audience. And in fact, we're going to enable you to speak via the microphone if you have a question. So in order to do that, if you could just message a short version of your question in the chat window and address it to all panelists and attendees, so we know that you've got a question. We will go through the questions, as many as we can, and let you have the floor for a short while so that you can say who you are, where you're from, what your question or comment is, and who you would like among our four panelists to address that question. And when we select the question, we'll turn on your microphone so everybody can hear you. If we have enough questions and comments, we're going to try and keep the webinar going until 11:20 a.m. Eastern Time. We've also had a few questions submitted, well, quite a lot of questions submitted when people registered for the webinar, and we'll try and address some of those if they don't crop up in the live Q&A. So I've just been looking through the chat function on the side, and I noticed a question in there from Jules Colomer. You'll have to excuse me if my pronunciation is not good. And so I don't know, Jules, if you'd like to address your question to the panelists. If we could open up Jules's mic, that would be great. The question was on the subject of, do you have a time or a cost estimate for applying the Resilience Dividend Valuation Model? I'm not sure if Jules is there, but perhaps that's something that you could address, Craig, if that's okay. And then if Jules has any further comments, he can come in afterwards. Thanks.
Sure. Actually, the short version of the answer is actually in the chat window now. But unfortunately, I fear that the answer will not be all that satisfying. And so it is one of two answers that an economist can give that is almost always right. And the answer is it depends. Essentially, in order to apply the model, we have to have an understanding of the system. And we also have to, depending on the context, whether we're going to be forward-looking or backward-looking, we may have to have some sort of a simulation modeling capability or some sort of data that can be used in order to estimate what the impacts of the particular intervention would be. So you can imagine in relatively straightforward cases where the system is rather small and relatively simple, and the intervention is of a nature that there's one or two primary impacts that are fairly easy to estimate, coupled with the fact that the distribution of potential shocks, if it's a forward-looking case, are fairly well understood, then it's sort of a reasonably simple matter of sort of a formal valuation exercise that where an econometric exercise could fairly rapidly estimate the resilience dividend. In cases where the system is much more complex and there are a variety of expected benefits from a particular intervention, especially benefits related to changing around the quality or quantity of social capital structures, the interventions that relax constraints and therefore enable alternative behaviors out of subsets of agents that are operating in the system. And then you have to have some means of figuring out or projecting what that behavior might be, or testing what that behavior actually was in the ex post case. It could get very complicated very quickly. What we noticed in the case studies that we took a look at, which are documented in the report in case anyone's interested, and as Megan mentioned, there were 6 of them. Let me just give a little background on those case studies. They were chosen in conjunction with the advisory panel that Sundaa mentioned in our conversations with Rockefeller. They were not chosen to be exemplars of how to use the particular resilience dividend valuation model optimally, ideally. Rather, the cases were chosen to meet a number of criteria about the types of projects that they were, and the types of interventions, and the geography, and those sorts of things, the complexity of the system. And then we basically used data that was already available to more or less do the best we could in order to estimate the resilience dividend. And you'll note as you go through there that in some cases we were successful in partially quantifying the dividend, and in other cases we were able to basically just qualitatively describe what we might like to do if we had the ability to go collect some more data. So in all of those cases, the data structures were a little bit different, the system complexity was a little bit different, and the time it took us to sort of analyze those systems, those 6 projects, varied from about a month all the way through most of the course of the project, 4 or 5 months. Ultimately, for very large scale projects or portfolios of projects, this could be a very large effort, multiple years, multiple projects, multiple, lots of impacts and lots of modeling. So the answer to the question is really is it's context dependent. It depends on the system.
I'm just wondering, Josh, if you'd like, sorry, Jules, apologies, if you'd like to come back on any of those points at all. Now we have you up there.
Okay, thanks, and hello everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question. Yeah, look, I was just thinking about the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor in Tanzania. It's an area that the government has obviously prioritized for agricultural development through a range of infrastructure and other policy enhancements, and that place is going to have a trajectory going forward. We are working there to try and ensure that that trajectory is inclusive and green, however we define that. And so I'm really been looking for a way to talk about that evolution and think about the difference between a business as usual trajectory and that more inclusive green, or in your case, resilient scenario in the future. So I think that we'd be on the large, complex, expensive end of the spectrum of your answer, but I think that there's potential there to think about how to apply this in that context. And I'm really excited to see this group of people working on it. So thanks very much, and I appreciate the answer, and look forward to hopefully catching up after this as well. Thank you.
Go over to Josh Woodward, sorry, who has a question about digital technologies. Go ahead, Josh.
Sure. Craig already answered it in the Q&A, but I basically, or the Q&A chat, but I was basically just asking if they had looked at all about specifically around measuring the resilience dividend as it relates to digital technologies and their impact on resilience.
Who would like to take that question, please? Craig or Mike, perhaps? Not sure if someone needs to be unmuted to answer that. Yep, Craig.
Yeah, hi, Megan. I was just saying, for whatever reason, the question cut off right in the middle there, so I'm not sure I got all of it. Is it possible to repeat?
It is. So the question was essentially, have you looked at all about how to measure the resilience dividend from technology, digital technologies?
So that particular application was not in the case set. Fundamentally, there's no reason that the valuation model couldn't be, right? It seems to me there that essentially the tech might, and this is not my area of expertise, so forgive me if this isn't applicable. But it seems to me that the way one would do this would be to think about how the technologies actually enable either differing behaviors or change particular cost structures in doing various things, and then trying to come up with the means of either, again, if this has already happened, sort of looking back and testing the hypothesis about whether those enabling behaviors, or whether those behaviors actually changed or the costs actually changed, or alternatively looking forward, sort of simulating out what might have happened. I think you know, in that particular case, the mapping exercise becomes critically important for setting up what we think the technologies might actually be doing to the system or within the system in order to change it. But again, without more details, it's hard to comment specifically. Certainly, the general idea, though, would be to compare with the technologies and without the technologies, and then see if there's some sort of valuation on the back end that could be done.
Thanks, Craig. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that. Please let us know if you do. We'll move on to the next question in that case. Josh Ayres has a question for Mike, which is about the impact of the process on communities. Josh, you should be able to speak now.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. No, my question was really just about a statement on one of his slides that referred to the community tension giving way to some sort of solution, and working from my perspective for sort of your classic international community development NGO. We're very interested in this sort of personal level resilience, and I realize the dividend model doesn't really quite get to that level of scale, but we're particularly interested in the social capital aspects and the sort of social cognitive aspects of resilience at that personal scale. And so my question was really around, you know, what or who was the catalyst for taking it from tension to sort of the solution? What was the change there that happened? But I'm not sure if it really is the best question for this panel. But anyway, just curious.
Why don't I attempt to answer that one, Megan?
Thanks, Mike.
Two things were really important. Firstly, the community realized it had a serious problem. Then it was running its groundwater resources down, and there was broad recognition about that, and a lot of internal fighting and argument about what to do. And then the second thing, which I guess came from me, was a very simple explanation to people about what might happen if they went to a totally new water allocation system. And it was a talk that I gave to them that really convinced them that the problem was that they had a flawed allocation system, and that had created a dysfunctional community. And within a period of about almost 5 minutes of just sort of saying there is an alternative future, suddenly everybody embraced it. And within a matter of about an hour, there was community consensus that they suddenly had a vision that could work. And they then, as a community, spent the next really 2 years shaping and working through the detail of how to make that transition work. So it was a combination of fear, concern, and a desire to find a new solution. And once everybody consolidated behind that, there was a rapid transition to a search for the detail that would enable them to go forward. It's an ongoing project. They're not there yet, and it could still all collapse. But as each step is taken, it's an important step. So it's an adaptive process. People in the talked about timeframes and implementation. The thing that I've been trying to capture most is that sense of community that returns, and a willingness for people, and lots of people, to put a lot of time collectively into finding a solution. I don't know how you quantify that dynamic, but it's just so important to have people willing to voluntarily put private time into finding a collective solution.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. That was actually my other question, was sort of a rhetorical one. You know, how in the world do we quantify that? But that's another question for another day, I guess.
I think it's very hard to quantify, but it's very important for the people involved in leading and starting the journey to be very aware of building the community dynamics, and not just saying, I have a mechanical solution, let's do this. The role of facilitators in all of this was very, very important, and the way the community ran the discussions was critically important.
I'll note on the valuation question there, you know, and this isn't sort of a magic bullet, but at least within the non-market valuation community, I mean, we do have ways of getting at the values of things that aren't traded in markets. And so this can include things like, you know, what somebody would be willing to pay in order to have a particular system or you know, set of meetings set up and those sorts of things. We can use revealed behaviors, as Mike suggests. There are people that are voluntarily giving up their time in order to go and participate in these types of activities. And so although this would be a serious underestimate of potential benefits, we could at least say for those individuals, you know, the value of that time that they're willing to give up, you know, because they've done so voluntarily, clearly they think that that effort is worth it. And so it's not easy, and it takes resources in order to get at some of these non-market values, but it is possible to use certain information in order to at least bound particular sets of benefits. In the Diamond Valley case, although we didn't have any particular information about the individuals in the community's willingness to pay for sort of the community stability aspects that will ultimately come out of changing the property rights structure around a little bit. But we were able to make an argument that said, you know, let's suppose that it's a year from now and a particular system is in place, and there were, you know, folks that were willing to give up some of their agricultural profitability, for example, in order to enable a longer run sustainable solution. Well, that provides some information that that longer term sustainable solution was in fact valuable to those people because they were willing to give up something of value in order to get it. And so those types of arguments, although not completely satisfying, do get us into the neighborhood of being able to value some of the sort of non-market aspects of these systems.
Okay, thanks very much, Craig and Mike. I think that's a pretty comprehensive overview of that aspect, the community aspect of things. We have another couple of questions lined up. One is from Matthew Dillon. It may be quite an economic angle, this one, because I'm not sure I fully understood the question in the chat. So Matthew, I'm going to let you put your question to the panel.
Hi, can you hear me?
I think you need to unmute. Yeah, we can now.
Okay, great. Craig, I was interested in what the model's view was on some of the parameters that might not be fully captured in GVA or GDP increases. So I'm particularly thinking about some of the typical benefits of resilience, such as prevention of fatalities, maybe improved mental health, and those sorts of things, and the extent to which they're captured by the model, or if they're not captured, your thoughts on how they might be captured through bolt-ons or other approaches.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So the foundations of the model are microeconomic in general rather than macroeconomic. And so to get a little bit into the weeds here, when we think about social welfare, really what we're thinking about is for each group of stakeholders a representative utility function at some level, right? So any particular flow, any good or service that's in that representative utility function is potentially of value. And so the valuation approaches that we would typically take here really stem from that. I was talking about the non-market valuation aspects before. Certainly, you mentioned the prevention of fatalities. So we could easily incorporate the value of statistical life sorts of considerations in there, and to the extent that we could get the quantities correct, then the valuation of those things using a VSL type of concept would be completely consistent with the model. Improved mental health, there seems like there could be a couple ways to go there. One aspect might be to sort of conceptualize the system in terms of the labor market and dealing with improved productivity, and then presumably the individuals being able to capture that improved productivity and wages. Another way to do that at, for example, community scale might be a sort of non-market valuation type of measure on providing programs or particular outcomes of those programs using, for example, surveys and those types of metrics. Those are the two that come to mind. But in general, because we're conceptualizing social welfare in a microeconomic sort of a way, anytime we can deal with a sort of consumer surplus type of idea on market or non-market goods, we're going to be consistent with how we originally sort of conceptualized the model. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. Well, maybe we could chat offline about this, but if any of those values featured within the case studies that you looked at, I'd be interested in finding out how you got to a value for example, value of prevention of fatality, or which kind of governmental values that you used in order to get there. Thanks.
I might just step in if I may, Megan. I think the hardest thing to understand and quantify is the counterfactual. What would have happened should the project have not come together? Can I predict the number of farms that would have gone bankrupt in the Diamond Valley under the counterfactual if that hadn't been an agreement to try and implement an alternative solution? No, I can't do that. Can I actually predict the number of families that would have broken up? No, I can't, but I know there would have been a number that would have occurred. Now, the sorts of things the community understands are critically important. They talk about them. I cannot find how much harm would have been done over the next 20, 30 years had the community not agreed to try and find an alternative solution.
Yeah, that's an important point. Thanks, Mike. I just want to move on to another question now, if that's okay. We have a question from Andreas Huck, who's lined up to put it to the panel, which is basically touching on how cities might use the RDVM in order to implement the projects that they're planning as part of their resilience strategies. But I shall let Andreas ask the question directly.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity to pose my question. Because I got to know about your valuation model via the newsletter, and just a couple of days later, I got another newsletter from the 100 Resilient Cities platform stating that quite a range of cities already have their strategies in place and now move on to implementing these strategies. And I'm wondering if the valuation model that you developed is of help in this implementation process, or if it is basically, directed to those cities that have not are not dealing with resilience right now. And I'm particularly interested in those projects, those resilience projects, including the private sector, for example, private infrastructure providers, because I think those infrastructure providers, they have their own tools and mechanisms, and they know the indicators that they are interested in. So that it might be more a question of how to get them interested in social well-being than how to get them interested in this particular tool.
Thanks, Andreas. In terms of the usefulness of the RDVM in the context of 100 resilient cities and where cities might be in a planning process, we'd like to think that there are uses in a couple of different ways. When we take an ex-ante stance, if cities have just embarked on a particular planning idea or prior to implementation, if they're trying to choose between what they'd like to do, then to the extent that the modeling capabilities exist to spin out what we might expect from a counterfactual and with the projects, then certainly what our model can do is take the principles of economic valuation that we sort of have embedded within this and allow the decision makers to think about which project or set of projects is actually most valuable in a social welfare sense, right? If that well-being that you saw on the right-hand side is reasonably comprehensive in terms of the various stakeholders, and I should point out and say this explicitly, but there's no reason to think that everything is a benefit, right? Some interventions will be costly to some subgroup of stakeholders, and that needs to be taken into account. Certainly then the sort of valuation side allows one to rank projects or portfolios of projects if one was interested in say maximizing the value to society. In other cases, there may be different objective functions. So for example, if a particular city was interested in some sort of justice concept, then splitting the sort of welfare side into various groups and trying to maximize the benefits to a particular group might be of interest, for example. So certainly the model could be used in a planning process in that way. In terms of somebody that's already made a decision about what to do and then implementing, I'm not so sure, unless there were still some decisions to be made, how useful the RDVM would be in the implementation process. However, on the back end, if we want to ask, did the project actually do what we thought it was going to do? Then the model would be of use, because we have this. We would have, in theory, have mapped the system and thought about the relationships within the system, and each of those relationships pretty much implies a hypothesis of what we thought the project might do. So if we collected the proper data, then we should be able to go back and test whether that actually happened or not. And so that's where we get into the program evaluation part of the model. So I think that was your first question. And the second question was about private infrastructure providers and sort of their interests in perhaps contributing to a public good. I don't think the model itself has much to say about that. As an economist, my first reaction to that is, well, essentially, if there's a way to capitalize in and appropriate some of the additional public good benefits in some way, through some risk-sharing arrangement or some other sort of mechanism, then it's certainly possible to get private firms interested in sort of the provision of public or quasi-public goods, but it all depends on the incentives, right? It all depends on the incentive compatibility between those private firms and the public sector.
Craig, I was just thinking it'd be useful to bring Evan in at this point, as he's got experience of working on those kind of projects in India and elsewhere. Evan, do you think this model can help entice private investors into resilient infrastructure projects, and if so, how?
Sure, and more importantly than just saying sure, I'll give you a little evidence that I think substantiates that. There is a movement that's happening within the infrastructure fundraising community as it pertains to developing sustainable infrastructure funds or green infrastructure funds. So I can envision a scenario where those fund managers implement this dividend model into their investment decision-making analysis that allows them to have a more holistic framework as it portrays to the economic in addition to the societal benefits that are emerging from projects that they're considering. Case in point, if we just think about it at a macro level, there is projected to be about $600 to $800 billion annually that is needed to be spent as we transition to a low carbon economy. So I would think all of those projects would certainly see great value in incorporating in this data and this means to quantify it.
Okay, thanks, Evan. We've only got about less than 10 minutes left, so I think we're going to try and get one more question in from Kim Fowler, which follows on from what we've just been discussing, talking about budget decisions for a municipality. So Kim, please go ahead.
Thank you. Essentially, municipalities make decisions by senior managers sitting around a table coming up with all of their departmental budget requests. And one of the things I've done is use a triple bottom line assessment tool, which takes away a lot of the conflict of why my department's budget decision package is better than yours. And that's helped a lot. But the tools have to be very simple because otherwise they don't get used. There's not a lot of time to do the assessment. So partly what I'm trying to do is to change it to an assessment not only of the triple bottom line, which is a sustainability piece, but how then to add the resilience component to that. Because that's, I really appreciate the comments from Evan about how to get it in and get it going now. And so if there's criteria or a process, a simple one that can be used in terms of a budget decision package, that would really help. I'm a sustainability consultant for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and I'm responsible for trying to how to put the resilience, sustainability, and climate change into the asset management process. And so this is one of the key tools: is where you put your money where your mouth is, and this is how you do it in the capital budget decision process. And it happens annually, so it can be done quite quickly. Thanks.
Who would like to take that one, please, if there's any comment on that from the panelists?
This is Evan. Can I just make a quick comment? Kim, I agree 100% with what you said, that this, in my opinion, needs to be put forth in the public domain. And the investment community needs to take a look at the model, figure out the means to simplify it, because we all know that something that's simplified and easy to use will be used. Something that is more challenging and more technically skilled will take some time. So I agree 100% with what you said, and would love to get some of the views of the other panelists as to how we can do that in a ramped up time period.
Yes, indeed. I think as we are running out of time now, that's a good place to ask the other panelists just to give us their final thoughts on where do we take the model from here in terms of getting it out there into the public hands, into municipalities, wherever it might be, financial markets, and getting it used by people. Perhaps we could start with Mike.
Thanks, Megan. I would like to encourage people particularly to search for ways to use it with projects that are about to start. So when you start the discussion with a group of people, to talk early on about the concepts that are so important in the broader dimensions that this framework gives. I think it's a very important add-on, and just the fact that people start trying to talk about it, I think shifts the nature of projects and makes them more comprehensive.
Thanks, Mike. Craig, I'm just wondering if you can fill us in on what RAND is planning to do next, or where does the model go from here, from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've touched on some of those issues here going forward. I really appreciate Evan and Kim's comments, and certainly we know that ideally a contribution to make to simplification is really going to be key towards using this model and making better decisions as a result of this model. So certainly that's one place where we need to go, is how do we take these very, very complex concepts and these dynamic multi-stakeholder, multi-effect sorts of ideas and sort of distill them. Part of the way that starts to happen, I think, ultimately, is as we get more and more information through various applications of the model, through additional case studies, especially those that are designed sort of from the ground up to have the data collection mechanism jointly developed with project development and implementation, could go a long way. And the parallel that I see here is in the economics world, in the environmental economics world. There's been 30 years of research on investigation of values related to environmental public goods. And the field has then taken that body of research and come up with benefit transfer techniques to take values that have come from other studies and take them to new places. And in fact, that's sort of what needs to happen here in terms of simplification. If we can get a sense of, sort of the values that are associated with certain types of interventions and certain changes in flows in particular circumstances, and we're able to transfer those over to new situations, that a spreadsheet-based type of tool, a simplified tool that gets you in the right ballpark, starts to be a little bit more attractive. The problem there is that we're not there yet. As Mike suggested, I think rightfully so, we're at the stage of the game where we're shifting the conversation around to think about all of these various additional benefits. And so I think what's needed is sort of a body of work that's a little bit more robust than the 6 case studies that sort of we went through, and just continuing to think about clever ways to use data in order to go about these valuation mechanisms. And then, of course, developing decision support that goes along with it, so that in cases where we don't have information, we can still make better decisions.
Thanks, Craig. Sunday, Rockefeller Foundation was behind this whole piece of work right from the start. Obviously, I'd like to let you have the last word on where you think it may go from here, and how Rockefeller may be able to support that.
Thanks, Megan. And again, I think the comments that Evan, Mike, and Kim made at the end hit it on the nail. This is a first step, and it's a really important step around sense making with respect to resilience dividend, in my view. We've been talking a lot about the notion of simplification, but what Mike mentioned about changing the conversation is that I think this step here with the framework allows us to do 3 things, and then we can figure out how we move forward. One is it gives us the language to actually talk about resilience in different contexts and understanding what that means as opposed to a business as usual, and helping to change the discussions that Mike referenced. And that's really important. And so while we might not call it the allocation mechanism, et cetera, and use the language that Craig mentioned, I think it's really important for people to understand those concepts and understand the importance of social capital in many of these investments, and understand the importance of looking at things more systemically. I think secondly, it really does offer people, particularly in ex-ante situations, a chance to look at their data collection system more carefully, to understand what information will be needed for them to make the kinds of decisions that we're all looking for, to choose from between project A and project B. Certainly it was a huge learning for us, as well as colleagues in the monitoring and evaluation community, that many of the projects, and Oxfam is certainly a pioneer in this area, we're collecting a lot of data, but not the right data for some of the questions that we have. And so I think the model allows us to start to look at the data points that really matter. And then, I mean, I think, you know, in terms of moving forward on this, would love to have additional case studies, would love to see how others pick this up and incorporate this into their work. Even having, you know, folks who do risk analysis, et cetera, look at the aspects of the framework and start to see what should be incorporated into the work that they do. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity here for us to learn more and for us to get to a place of a more simplified case. I don't know that it'll ever be, I shouldn't say this, I'm not sure about the standardization and how it will apply in all different contexts. I think that's really challenging, but I do think there is certainly a lot that can be done around simplification, and having the additional cases will help us do that, particularly ones that are just starting, as Mike said.
Thanks very much, Sunday. That leaves us with a lot of food for thought. And from the chat on the side of the webinar, I'm definitely getting the feeling that this is just the start of the conversation, and that there's a lot of people who are interested in doing a great deal more work on this model in terms of its application and usefulness out there in the real world. So for the short term, we will have a write-up of the key takeaways from this conversation on Zilliant, as well as a video in case you missed some of it or would like to share with colleagues. And we're going to hopefully have that posted on zilliant.org sometime tomorrow. So please do check back on the website for those materials, and feel free to comment and keep the conversation going. So with that, I'm going to close the webinar and say thank you so much to our panelists for all their fantastic insights and ideas, and also to our audience who have helped to make this conversation a lively and deep and meaningful one. Thank you very much for now, and hope to see you on Zilliant again soon.